Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive in. Today, it's the Venezuelan exodus we're tackling. And wow, it's huge, just the scale of it. We're talking over 7 million people leaving since 2015. That's like, I don't know, imagine the entire population of Hong Kong just picking up and moving.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? And what's interesting is it's not just about fleeing, it's the after. What happens to these people? How do you rebuild a life, a whole country even, after this kind of upheaval?
Exactly, and we've got some amazing sources to help us understand it all. Personal stories, reports from, economists, aid groups, even some government perspectives thrown in.
It's a story of resilience, that's for sure, and it really makes you see how connected the world is. You can't have this many people on the move without it affecting everything, neighboring countries, global economies, even how we define refugees versus migrants.
Absolutely. So to kick us off, let's get into some of these personal stories. This one, Eli's journey, really stayed with me. She's 21, a mother, and she crossed the Darien Gap, that's that jungle between Colombia and Panama, while she was pregnant.
It's hard to imagine the kind of desperation that would make someone take that risk. And her story doesn't stop there. Even reaching the U.S., she ends up in a New York City shelter, just trying to make ends meet.
It really makes you question, what does success even look like in that situation? Is it just getting to a certain country, or is it something more? And then there's Maddie. She went to Colombia 6 years ago, and now she's thinking about moving to the U.S. because, well, costs are rising, and there's more hostility toward Venezuelans there now.
Right. That shows how this exodus, it's not just a Venezuelan problem, it's regional, global even. Yeah. Colombia, they've been amazingly generous, granting temporary protected status to 2.5 million Venezuelans. But that comes at a cost, both financially and socially.
Makes you think about the unintended consequences, the good and the bad, of large-scale migration like this. We also have this really powerful story of Luisa Gomez, a single mom in Colombia, selling toiletries on buses to feed her 5 kids. These stories are incredibly moving, but I'm also curious about what caused this whole crisis in the first place. I mean, Venezuela used to be the richest country in Latin America. How did things go so wrong?
So it's more complicated than just oil prices and U.S. sanctions, although those are part of it. We have to look at the economic policies that were implemented, under Hugo Chavez.
This is what I find so fascinating. Cause and effect on such a massive scale. What were those policies exactly, and how did they contribute to the economic downfall?
Chavez, he was all about socialist policies, nationalizing industries, price controls, aiming to redistribute wealth, help the poor. And at first it was popular, especially with oil prices high. But over time, well, it messed things up. We have this account from Jorge Redman, a Venezuelan chocolate maker.
Oh, what happened to him?
Under Chavez, the steps to export his chocolate, they went from just 4 to, get this, 90. Just to illustrate how those policies, not just outside factors, they really strangled businesses and stopped economic growth.
90 steps. That's insane. It makes you wonder how anything got done at all.
Yeah, it was like a system designed to fail. And then you throw in price controls leading to shortages, plus the drop in oil prices, which Venezuela was totally reliant on. It was the perfect storm for economic collapse.
So it was a bunch of things all connected that led to this crisis. We keep hearing this term, temporary protected status offered to migrants. Can you break that down for us, what it actually means and what its limitations are?
Sure. Temporary protected status, TPS, it's a legal status, but temporary for people from certain countries, if there's war, a disaster, or something really bad happening there. For Venezuelans, it means they can live and work legally in the host country for a while, and they can't be deported.
So it's like a safety net, but temporary. Does it lead to citizenship?
Not automatically. It's important to remember TPS isn't a permanent fix. It's meant to give people a break while things hopefully get better back home. Whether they can apply for something more permanent later, that depends on each country's laws.
I see, but then it raises the question, what happens if they can't go back and their TPS runs out?
That's the big worry. Many Venezuelans are stuck in this uncertain situation. It shows the need for more lasting solutions, either finding ways to stay permanently in host countries or, even better, making Venezuela safe enough for people to go back willingly.
And that brings us back to the day after idea, when things stabilize enough to rebuild. It's such a huge concept.
It is. And to even get there, there are so many challenges and opportunities.
I imagine it's like starting from scratch in many ways. What would rebuilding a country in that state even look like?
It's a massive undertaking. We're talking about fixing the economy, the infrastructure, bringing back essential services like healthcare, education, and then there's the emotional healing, the social fabric that's been torn apart.
It's not just about buildings and roads. It's about rebuilding trust, rebuilding hope. So to even reach that day after, what are some key things that would need to happen?
First and foremost, a political solution. That means addressing the divisions within Venezuela, having a legitimate government that people trust, and, of course, free and fair elections.
That's a tall order given the current situation. And economically speaking, how do you even begin to fix hyperinflation and a collapsed economy?
It's going to take a lot. Stabilizing the currency is key, maybe even dollarization, just to get people believing in the money again. Then attracting foreign investment, that's crucial for jobs and growth, but that only works if there's political stability and, clear rules.
So the political and economic sides are completely intertwined. And what about the rest of the world? What role would the international community need to play?
International support is essential. We're talking debt relief, technical help to rebuild institutions, and, of course, humanitarian aid to address the immediate needs. But it has to be done effectively, transparently, to prevent corruption.
That's a lot to unpack. But understanding those potential paths to recovery, it gives me a glimmer of hope, a sense that even after such a devastating crisis, there's a chance for a better future.
I agree, and that's why I think thinking about the day after is so important. It lets us look beyond the immediate crisis and start imagining solutions, positive change. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always the possibility for renewal. We were talking about the day after. That time when things in Venezuela get stable enough to start rebuilding. It's a huge thing to think about.
It is, and we've talked about the political stuff, the economics, but there's that human side too, right? Millions of people have built new lives somewhere else. Would they even want to go back?
That's a big question. There's no way to know for sure, right? Some might have put down roots, families, careers. Going back wouldn't be a simple choice.
Because, you can never really go back home, can you? Things change, people change. But for those who do go back, what would they be facing?
It wouldn't be easy. I mean, it's not just finding a place to live. It's going back to a society that's gone through so much trauma. There might be resentment from people who stayed, not enough jobs or resources, and just the mental and emotional toll of everything they've been through.
So even if the day after comes, it's not a happy ending, more like a whole new set of challenges.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of empathy, a lot of understanding from everyone. And that brings us back to right now, where millions of Venezuelans are trying to make a life in other countries with their own set of problems. We talked about Colombia giving temporary protected status, but what does that actually mean for people on the ground?
That's what I'm curious about. What's life like for Venezuelans in Colombia?
Well, Colombia's been incredibly generous, but think about it. Taking in 2.5 million Venezuelans, that's like if everyone in Houston suddenly moved to Chicago.
Wow, that really puts it in perspective.
Yeah, just a lot of people. And it's put a strain on everything. Hospitals, schools, housing, jobs are scarce.
It must be really hard for both Venezuelans and Colombians, this whole shift in their society. Has it caused any problems?
There's definitely been some tension. At first, people were really sympathetic, welcoming. Colombians, they remember their own troubles with displacement during their armed conflicts, so they get it. But as the crisis drags on and the economy's not doing great, there's more xenophobia, more resentment coming out.
It shows you even the most welcoming places have limits. And when people are struggling, it's easy to turn on each other.
It's true, and that's part of Mari's story, the woman who went to Colombia 6 years ago. Now she's thinking of going to the U.S., partly because of that hostility.
It's complicated, right? It's not just escaping one country. It's about finding a place where you truly feel safe and welcome, where you can actually build a future.
Exactly, and that feeling of belonging, it's not always there, even if you're legally allowed to be somewhere. It takes effort from everyone, the migrants and the people who are already there.
We've talked about what host countries are going through, but what about the rest of the world? How have they responded to this crisis? Has it been enough?
It's a mixed bag, really. I mean, countries like Canada, the U.S., some European nations, they've recognized the problem. They're giving financial aid. The World Bank, too. But it's still not enough to deal with this many people needing help.
Feels like too little, too late sometimes.
There's definitely that feeling. The world was slow to react. Maybe they thought it was just a regional thing. And that leaves countries like Colombia and Peru bearing most of the weight.
Makes you wonder, what are global priorities, really? Some crises get a huge response, others, like this one, even though it's so big, not so much.
It's a good question, and it makes you think about how we as a world respond to these things. Is it based on shared responsibility or more on politics and economics?
We've focused a lot on the people who left Venezuela, but I'm curious about the ones who stayed. What are their lives like?
For those who are still there, it's a constant struggle just to get by. Imagine hyperinflation so bad, your money's practically worthless. Not enough food, medicine, even basic things like electricity and water are unreliable.
I've seen pictures of people with stacks of cash just to buy bread. It's hard to comprehend how a society even functions like that.
It breaks down trust. There's no hope. People have to make impossible choices just to survive. A lot of them are bartering, selling everything they own, relying on money sent from family who left.
It's amazing they're coping at all.
They're incredibly resilient. They've adapted to a life where scarcity is normal, relying on each other and their own resourcefulness to get by.
But it's not just the economic hardship, right? There's the political situation, too. What's it like living under a government accused of human rights abuses, cracking down on anyone who disagrees?
That's the other side of it. Venezuela is deeply divided. Maduro's regime has been accused of silencing the opposition, controlling what people can say, even using violence against protesters.
It sounds terrifying.
It is for a lot of people. They're afraid to speak up, worried about what will happen to them or their families. It's like being trapped with no way out.
It's a reminder that the cost of this crisis, it's not just on the people who left, but on those who stayed too, facing hardships that we can barely imagine.
It's true. We see the dramatic images of people crossing borders, but it's important to remember the suffering of those who remain, trying to navigate a life that's becoming increasingly difficult.
We've talked about aid organizations helping migrants, but what are the challenges they face in actually getting that aid to people?
A lot of obstacles. First, the scale of it is just enormous. The number of people who need help is staggering. You need massive resources and coordination. Then there's the logistics, trying to get aid into a country where the infrastructure is falling apart and there are shortages everywhere.
It's like trying to deliver a package to a house with no address, no roads even.
Exactly. And then you add in the politics. Maduro's regime doesn't trust international organizations. They see them as meddling in their affairs. They make it difficult for them to operate freely and effectively.
It's a minefield, basically.
It can feel that way. And then there's the issue of corruption. Always a risk that aid will be diverted, misused, especially when there's not much transparency.
It's heartbreaking to think of aid meant for people in need ending up in the wrong hands.
It's a serious issue, which is why there needs to be careful monitoring. Aid organizations also have to think about sustainability, making sure their help empowers people, not creates dependence.
It's a tough balance, providing immediate relief but also thinking long-term.
Exactly, and that requires really understanding the situation, working with the communities, and focusing on things that build resilience and self-sufficiency.
We've talked about individual countries, international groups, but what about regional organizations? What are they doing about the Venezuelan crisis?
Regional groups, like the Organization of American States, the OAS, and the Lima Group, they've been pretty active. They've condemned the human rights violations, called for fair elections, and provided some humanitarian help.
It seems like regional groups might be more effective than global ones in dealing with regional issues. Do you think that's true in this case?
I think there's some truth to that. Regional groups often have a better understanding of what's going on, and they can move faster than big global institutions that are often slower and more bureaucratic.
We've seen a lot of cooperation between countries in taking in migrants.
Absolutely. Neighboring countries have stepped up in a big way, showing a sense of shared responsibility and regional solidarity. But there have also been some disagreements.
What kind of disagreements?
Well, they don't all agree on how to deal with the Venezuelan government. Some prefer dialogue, while others want tougher sanctions, even military action. It reflects the bigger global debate on dealing with authoritarian regimes.
It's like a miniature version of the challenges the whole world faces.
Exactly, and these divisions make it hard to come up with a unified regional response. But even with the disagreements, regional groups are still vital in mediating talks, providing aid, and pushing for a peaceful solution.
It shows how important regional diplomacy and cooperation are when dealing with these big, complicated issues that cross borders. We've explored the economics, the politics, the social impact of the Venezuelan exodus. But what about its cultural impact? How has this mass displacement affected both the migrants and the societies they've joined?
The cultural impact is massive and multifaceted. For migrants, it's a process of adapting, learning new languages, customs, and social norms. They try to hold on to their heritage while also embracing new experiences.
We've seen Venezuelan music, food, traditions becoming popular in other countries.
Absolutely. It shows how resilient and creative they are, sharing their culture even though they've been displaced. But integration isn't always easy. There can be tension and misunderstandings between migrants and the communities they join.
What are some of the challenges they face?
Cultural differences can sometimes lead to prejudice and discrimination. Language barriers can make it hard to find work and integrate into society. It's a process that takes patience, understanding, and a willingness to embrace diversity from both sides.
And what about the long-term impact? How is this exodus changing the cultural identities of both Venezuela and the countries receiving its people?
It's creating a new Venezuelan diaspora, a community spread across the globe, connected by their shared experiences. This diaspora is already making a difference, contributing to the cultures, economies, and societies of their new homes.
It's like seeds being scattered, taking root in new soil.
That's a beautiful way to put it. As these communities grow, they'll influence and be influenced by the cultures around them, creating this dynamic mix of traditions and values.
It's a reminder that migration isn't just about people moving, it's about cultures blending, ideas spreading, and human connections reshaping the world in ways we can't always predict.
It's a powerful force for change, both challenging and enriching the societies involved. The Venezuelan exodus is a story that's still unfolding, and its cultural impact will continue to be felt for generations, leaving a lasting mark on both the migrants and the places they now call home.
Throughout this deep dive, we've heard incredible stories of resilience, families facing unimaginable choices, and communities grappling with the ripple effects of a crisis that goes far beyond national borders.
It's been a journey through heartache and hope, showing how strong the human spirit can be, how adaptable and enduring, even when facing overwhelming challenges.
We've looked at the complex web of economic, political, and social factors that fueled this exodus, and we've glimpsed the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for both those who left and those who stayed.
It's a story that deserves our attention, our empathy, and our willingness to learn from it. It's a stark reminder that we live in a world where we're all connected, where the choices we make, the policies we support, and the actions we take can have profound and lasting impacts on people's lives, no matter how far away they may seem.
We've covered a lot, and I want to thank you for joining us on this journey.
We encourage you to keep exploring this complex issue, engage with the human stories, and think about what role you can play in building a more just and compassionate world.
We'll be back in a moment to wrap up our deep dive into the Venezuelan exodus. We've been talking about the cultural impact and the folks who stayed in Venezuela, but it's the ripple effect that gets me. We've seen how neighboring countries are dealing with this, but what about the whole world? How's this exodus played out globally?
It's definitely changed how we talk about migration, about people being forced from their homes. The Venezuelan exodus has become one of the largest displacement crises we've seen. I mean, numbers-wise, it's almost up there with the Syrian refugee crisis.
Wow, I had no idea it was that big. Makes you wonder why it's not getting the same kind of attention worldwide.
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes you think about how we as a global community decide which crises are more important, how we respond. And the Venezuelan situation, it's really challenged how we define refugees versus migrants,
That's been on my mind too. It's not always clear-cut, is it? Some people are running from political persecution, others from a terrible economy, and a lot of them, it's both. So how does that affect their legal status, their ability to get help?
It's made things very messy. Every country has its own laws, its own definitions, so the level of support and protection for Venezuelans varies a lot. Some countries have been amazing, offering temporary protected status. Others, not so much.
It just shows how we need a better system, a global response to migration that's more coordinated, more humane, one that recognizes that it's not always black and white, refugee or migrant, and make sure people fleeing horrible situations get the help they need no matter what label we put on them.
I couldn't agree more. The Venezuelan exodus is a perfect example of why we need to look beyond those strict categories and address the root causes of displacement, whether it's the economy, politics, or social issues.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, but let's take a step back. What could be the long-term effects of all this for Venezuela and the rest of the world?
One of the biggest is brain drain. Venezuela has lost a huge chunk of its skilled workers, doctors, engineers, teachers, people who start businesses. That loss of talent, it's going to have a lasting impact on the country's ability to recover and grow.
It's like losing the very people who could build a better future.
Exactly. But on the other hand, this Venezuelan diaspora, they have the potential to be a real force for positive change. They're bringing their skills, their knowledge, their entrepreneurial spirit to their new homes, contributing to economies and societies around the world.
So it's a loss for Venezuela, but a gain for others. It's another reminder that migration is this complicated thing with both good and bad consequences.
Exactly. And it's important to have those nuanced conversations, acknowledging both sides of the story.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what keeps coming back to me are the human stories. The resilience, the sacrifices people have made, the hope they hold on to for a better future. It's a powerful reminder that behind all the numbers, the headlines, there are real people going through unimaginable things.
It shows the strength of the human spirit, but it's also a call to action. We can't just ignore this crisis, become numb to the suffering.
What are some of the key things you hope our listeners take away from all this?
I hope they come away with a deeper understanding of how complicated this crisis is, how interconnected our world is, and how important it is to be empathetic and to act. The Venezuelan exodus, it's not just a regional problem, it's a global one that needs our attention and our willingness to get involved.
I couldn't agree more. This story is far from over, and it's up to all of us to learn from it, to be compassionate, and to work towards a world that's more just and equitable, a world where everyone has a chance at a life with dignity and hope. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Venezuelan exodus.